Welcome to another episode of the Chronic Comeback podcast. This week, I'm really happy to welcome on the show Jami Emerson. So Jami, like many others that we've had on the podcast before, had a seemingly very normal life, a very healthy life with a normal trajectory, only for that suddenly to be taken away when she began to develop debilitating symptoms that eventually was diagnosed as chronic fatigue. And so the trajectory of her life, as it were, had been completely changed from that point. So rather than dwell on the cards that she was dealt, she vowed that she would focus on her recovery and actually set a crazy goal of moving to Australia and being recovered by that time. Fast forward to today, she's living in Sydney, Australia, and has gone on to actually completely thrive in her life and gone on to set up a number of different endeavours, one of which being Chronic Hope, which is a company that helps people with chronic health issues that, and she can go into more detail, and I'd love her to talk about that. Has launched a podcast, The Sound of Hope, which again I'd love to hear more detail on, and something which is coming up called The House of Hope. And this is just the start of, I was speaking to Jami just before the podcast began, and this is just the start of her world domination. I'm sure there will be many other companies that will be launched. So Jami's exactly the kind of person that I love having on this podcast. Her chronic illness wasn't something that defined her. It was something that actually pushed her on to the next level in her life, and something that actually probably caused her to be, a better version of herself, and just such a great example for people listening to this podcast going through dark times at the moment. So enough of me talking. Jami, welcome. How are you?
Hi, thank you. I'm good. That was quite an intro.
Good. Well, there's a lot to talk about. So, look, before we get on to the stuff that's going on right, today, that's amazing. I really want to go back to when it wasn't so amazing, and when this all began. So could you just take us back to that point, what life was like before, but then just take us through that story of how you got sick, and kind of just really take us through to today.
Yeah, look, I think it goes back a bit far. Thanks for having me on, by the way, and thanks for that gorgeous intro. But yeah, and I love what you're doing, and just the whole idea of spreading awareness around chronic illness recovery, and not even necessarily just recovery, but also thriving within the boundaries of a chronic condition sometimes, which is totally possible. But yeah, so I guess, I'm currently 28. I would rewind to 19 years old when I graduated high school, originally from the United States of America, West Coast, Oregon. Was homeschooled, graduated high school, and then moved directly from high school to living in Paris, France, where I lived for 3 years at the age of 19. And I would say that's where my adult life began, but that's probably also where my health issues came from. And it wasn't necessarily health in terms of my physical health was bad at the time. It was more my mental health, because I was what they call a fille au pair in Paris, which is a live-in nanny for a couple of families. And I was mistreated in those families. One of the families that I lived with was the dad was actually physically abusing the kids, and I was scared for myself, and I was scared for the kids. And there was this, and the reason why I'm bringing this up is because I feel that was really the beginning of a depression for me. It was this period of 3 months where I lived with the family. I was about an hour and a half outside of the city, very isolated, and living with this family that, I didn't know them that well. And the dad was abusing his children, and he was also verbally abusing me. And I was 20 at that point, and I just didn't know. I didn't have the skills to deal with that, especially in a foreign country, in a foreign language. And I think that's really where I spiraled downward into a depression, and had that depression during the 3 years that I lived in France. And I lived in France for, like I said, 3 years, studied, worked, was really, had a really good community. I loved living there, but I did have that underlying depression and this feeling of something wasn't quite right. And fast forward to 2015, I flew back to the US for a holiday with my family for a wedding. And during that time, we got in a really, really traumatic car accident. It was my dad, my mom, and my two sisters in the car. I was in the front seat. My dad blacked out while he was driving. He was probably going around 45 miles per hour, which would probably translate to around 65, 70 kilometers per hour. And the car flipped a couple of times. We hit a telephone pole. And it was traumatic. All of us were fine. My mom broke her collarbone. Other than that, we were unscathed, which is, in my view, a miracle. But that's really and the reason why I go back to that moment of living with that abusive family is because that's where the depression started. But then the accident is where my body and my psyche, I think, couldn't handle it anymore. Because I had been, and it's the typical chronic fatigue syndrome story. I was type A personality, overdoing it, studying, working, high achiever, lots of pressure on myself for a prolonged period of time, traumatic event, chronic fatigue syndrome. And that's the pattern that, I think probably 90% of people I've talked to who've gotten chronic fatigue syndrome, that's been the pattern. And often the traumatic event or a catalyst event is a virus for them. So even, for example, with COVID, we're seeing a rise in people getting chronic fatigue syndrome from COVID. There's actually some statistical evidence around that. Anyway, so the car accident is what started the chronic fatigue. I moved back I went back to Paris. And about 2 or 3 months later, I started getting chronic pain and fatigue. And that was the beginning.
And you mentioned pain, because when I hear chronic fatigue, the symptoms do seem to vary quite a lot. Some people don't get that much pain; it's just they can't get out of bed. What was the pain like for you, and what kind of pain?
So the pain started in my back, and I was working in hospitality at the time, and I had to get like a back brace and to kind of support my back as I was working. And and then it started in the back, and then, it's kind of over the years migrated to different parts of my body. It's become like joint pain, aches in my neck, aches in my knees and ankles. And and so it kind of has migrated. So for me, it was the chronic fatigue, but it was also the chronic pain, and they kind of played off each other as well.
And so you're, so you're like 23 at this point?
Yep, exactly. So I, 23, so got in the car accident.
Yeah.
Started getting symptoms. And then I had to drop out of uni and move in with a couple that south of Paris that were actually Australian, and lived with them for 2 months. And I thought, look, I'm going to stop working. I stopped working, I stopped studying, and I was like, I'm going to rest for 2 months. Mm-hmm. And if I get better, that's great. If not, I'll probably have to move back to the US. Because I was, I didn't have a support, I had somewhat of a support system, but I was an international student. Like, I didn't have access to the resources I needed to look after myself. So 2 months went by and I was still unwell. And so then I made the decision to move back at the age of 23, which was one of the hardest decisions in my life. I didn't want to move back to the US. Ever since I was in high school, I haven't wanted to live in the US. So I moved back. It was the right decision though, because I moved back. I got diagnosed with chronic fatigue by a naturopath and started going down that journey of knowing what it was and then recovering from that.
Could you just talk to us a little bit about the mental side of things at this point? Because you're 23. It's quite a transformative time in someone's life. They're just kind of going through this stage from being a teenager into an adult life. You've got all of these goals ahead of you, being a type A personality as well. Someone telling you to your body, and a doctor telling you to slow down when all you want to do is speed up. How was that for you mentally, and how did you kind of like get through that part of your life?
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting because I've said this many times. The depression that I had, I actually recovered from it before I got chronic fatigue syndrome, which I think was, for me, very good, because I don't know if I could have had depression, chronic fatigue, and chronic pain at the same time.
Yeah.
So I'd done a lot of mental health work prior. And then look, when I got diagnosed, yeah, I'm trying, it was the combination of moving back to the US from Paris, but also getting sick, that I think really was hard, because in my mind, my future was in Europe. In my mind, I was going to finish my degree. I was going to build a life in France, and I had a whole support network, community, people that I would call family there. And then I had to move back to the US, and where I didn't really have much other than my immediate family, because I was homeschooled. So I didn't even have a lot of like high school friends or primary school friends. And then it was the complete loss of Paris, but also the complete unknown moving forward, if that makes sense, because Paris was the future for me. And so before I moved back to the US from Paris, I had already decided I was going to move to Australia. This is before I got diagnosed. This is before, before I moved, and I was telling people I'm going to move to Australia. And
had you ever been to Australia at that point?
Yeah, I went right before I moved to Paris.
Okay.
And I loved it.
Yeah.
And again, it's that, I don't know how to explain it. It's like, and it's not that I have anything against America itself. It's just I had this feeling that when I was there, that I didn't belong, that I'm walking around in this space and I'm in these conversations or in these situations, and I wasn't meant to be there. And I never had that in Paris, and I have never had that in Australia. So it's nothing personal against the US. It's just this sense that I've always had. So the mental side was like obviously really devastating. But at the end of the day, I also had set that goal of moving to Australia. And I'm kind of a practical person in the sense of like, okay, when I see a problem or a challenge, I'm like, okay, what do I need to do? How do I get out of this? And so when I got diagnosed, it was like, cool, now I know what it is. Did all the research on Google, right? And what you read about chronic fatigue syndrome is the recovery rate's 5%. Yeah. There's no hope, there's no options, good luck. And this was 5 years ago, and there was even less options at the time. There was a support group out 15-minute drive from my house that I wanted to attend but couldn't because I was too fatigued. And so, yeah, I think when I read that, I was like, okay, well, I'm going to be one of the 5%. There it is. At least there's 5%. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there were times, like, I vacillated between I'm going to overcome this and this sucks, and I don't know if I want to keep going because it's too much. It's too much pain. It's too much fatigue. And the thought of death actually feels like relief as opposed to something to be afraid of. And, there was so much in that, that season, because there was a lack of support as well from my family. And, we've talked about it now and move forward and all of that, but I didn't know how to advocate for myself. They didn't know what chronic fatigue syndrome was. They didn't know how bad it was because I didn't talk about it. And because there's not a lot of awareness around chronic fatigue syndrome. So I ended up kind of having to set up a GoFundMe to pay for my medical expenses and work when I probably really should have been resting and looking after my health, because they didn't want to enable me to be lazy. But at the end of the day, I had like a legitimate health condition. So there was also that component of like trying to overcome, but also without that support that I really needed as well.
Yeah. So just I think that's a really interesting point. And I struggle with it with with my family a little bit in the sense that it's not their fault because they just don't get it because they haven't been through it, and it can be quite difficult when I think they so much don't get it. It's so like not what they're used to. They're so in the traditional medical system that it's not that they don't care. It's just that it's just so beyond what they're capable of understanding in the current like traditional Western medical system. So it's really difficult to get out of that mindset that like they're. I guess were you thinking at the time like, oh, do they care? Was there an underlying worry almost that do they even care in that respect?
No, I think that I probably felt that more later than in the moment, because I was so sick. I didn't know how, like, what I was going through. I didn't know how to communicate it. I also kind of grew up in a family where we tend to disassociate from emotions. So like sharing emotions or sharing, struggles and all of that was like not really a thing, if that makes sense. Like, so they didn't see the extent of the struggle because I masked it. I masked it from everyone except this one friend that I had, where she also had chronic pain, and we'd sit around and talk about how much pain it was like, that was my one friend, where I could just let it out. But I think, they cared. They definitely cared. I think it's just a level of education, and it's the traditional medical system, like I had a conversation with my family where I was like, oh, I'd been seeing a naturopath for a while, and then one of my parents said to me, you should see a regular doctor. And I said to them, they're not going to do anything for me. I know they're not going to do anything for me. But I went to see the regular doctor because for them, just because they wanted me to. I was like, okay, that's fine, I'll go. This doctor told me that chronic fatigue syndrome, they didn't really want to deal with chronic fatigue syndrome because it was like a bit too much for them. That the yeast infection, the candida yeast infection I had in my gut was like not really a thing. It's like they acknowledged that it was a condition and that there was this problem, but they didn't want to deal with it. And so I did what I do, which is, and I've done this my whole life, I followed my gut. And I remember saying at the time, I was like, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do these natural treatments because that's the right thing. And I'm going to do this, and I'm going to recover, and I'm going to move to Australia. And I remember at the time, people were like, how are you going to do that? You're sick. You don't have money. You can't work. And I was like, just wait. It's going to happen. I'm going to move. I'm going to make it happen. And that's what ended up happening. So I think, with the whole family dynamics around that, like we've had several conversations around it, and I think that there's a lot of healing that's happened since then, because it was a really dark period of my life. And yes, I wish I would have gotten that support I needed. At the end of the day, I choose forgiveness, and I choose to believe that they did want the best for me, even though I didn't necessarily get that. And the takeaway from that is, even as I'm going through things now, taking the time to educate them about how I'm feeling, and taking time to educate the people around me about what's actually happening in my life, which is essentially like recently I've realized that I have what's called complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And that comes with a whole range of symptoms. And people don't know how to deal with complex. They just don't. Most people don't know how to deal with complex mental health issues where you're like experiencing suicidal ideation and severe like depressive episodes and all of that. And so I don't really talk about it with most people. But if people do want to talk about it or want to support me, then I send them articles about complex PTSD. And if those people are willing to read those articles or do the research about the condition, that's one way they can understand and support. That doesn't require a lot of energy from myself. And I've told my family that now, like, I mean, because I think this is a good topic to talk about as well, because I don't know if people I haven't really heard a lot of people talk about this on podcasts, but I was having a conversation with my mom recently, and I was like, look, let's not repeat the same mistake. You know that I have complex PTSD and some issues due to trauma in my life. Look up articles about it, read about it, understand what a victim of trauma goes through, or someone with complex PTSD. Look up what they go through. Try to understand, because I don't have the energy. I didn't say this, but in my mind I'm like, I don't have the energy to sit down and explain to you why I'm triggered when the randomest thing happens. Then I can't control it, you know? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does. It does. I think, again, it's going back to, with like relationships, it's going back to like, and what you said then is so true. Like, I often like send articles to people and say, this will explain it a lot better than I can, because it's almost like when, I don't know if you have the same thing, but when I'm trying to understand it myself as well. So when I should then try and relay that back to someone else, it just doesn't come across in the right kind of way. So then they don't understand it. And so then they're confused. It almost feels like there's more of a disconnect then. Did you have that issue with, I know you mentioned maybe you didn't have as many friends back in the US, but friends that you did have, did that cause an issue with them as well?
Yeah, look, I think like I said, I had one friend. I had two pretty good friends. I would say it probably was a bigger issue with my family, and more actually recently, because I'm recovered from chronic fatigue syndrome, but I do still have chronic pain, and I haven't been able to walk properly for the last year and a bit, because I have an ongoing ankle issue. So if I walk longer than a couple hundred meters, then I'm in pain. So the whole friendship thing has been and relationships in general has been a difficult thing for me to navigate, but also in the context of my chronic illness for sure, because it's that, I think as well, because I do not want my illness to define me, right? I don't want my pain to define me. I don't want my chronic fatigue to define me. And I don't really talk about it that much because, you know, if someone asks me at any given moment if I'm in pain, I'm going to say, yes, I'm always in pain. But I don't want to talk about my pain all of the time because I don't see the point. I don't want to disassociate from it, but I also don't want it to dictate, you know, like my moods, my emotions. So I've actually had to really learn to advocate for myself, you know, like stuff like, hey guys, I actually can't do that because I can't walk longer than 300 meters. And that's just where I'm at. And it's been really good because in more recent times, my friends actually are sort of starting to plan things around me and making sure as well that, like, if we need to walk longer than 500 meters, someone drives me, or we make sure we can get a park really close, or that sort of thing, which is really good. It really feels very supportive. I don't know. Does that answer your question?
No, it does. And you raise a really good point, actually, about, and something that I have made the effort to try and do, is not voicing you know, what I'm going through in terms of how I'm feeling. That sounds, again, it's not, it's putting that negativity out there. So when someone asks how I am, like, I immediately now say, oh, I'm really good, thanks. Like, even regardless of how I'm feeling, I'll always say, like, I'm really, rather than going, oh, do you know what, I feel like shit today, or like, I'm so tired, or because one, that's actually then creating like a negative energy between me and that person who probably only wanted like a couple of minutes of interaction with me. And two, it's actually putting that negative energy out there into the universe, essentially, that, yeah, that I am really tired. And then I start to identify with that a lot. So it's not, I'm not denying that I'm not like trying to escape from the fact that that's how I'm feeling. But if I'm constantly dwelling on that emotion and how I'm feeling, then it really, it's a bit of almost like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It will just keep myself in that negative cycle. And I think that's kind of what you were saying. Is that right?
Yeah, look, I think it's a mix of both, because I definitely, there's times where I put on, I choose to like put on more positive energy and put better things out there. I think it's knowing your audience, to be honest. I think that's what it is, because it's like, there are people, like, if I'm going to meet up with friends and we're going out to dinner, we're going to have a nice dinner, and they're like, Jamie, how are you going? Like, how was your day? I'm not going to be like, yeah, oh, good, just laying on the couch, crying for the last 3 hours, dealing with stuff that's come up, trauma, there may have been some suicidal ideation. And it's not funny, but it's like, you don't want to bring that into that space, right? But it's likely that I would have called one of my sisters or one of my friends that day and said, hey, like, this is what's going on. Like, I'm not doing well, and I'm trying to, get out of this headspace, but I also want to acknowledge my emotions. So I think it's like, yeah, it's a delicate balance of like, and it's a fine line. It's the line between acknowledging but not letting it define you.
Yeah. And to be honest, sometimes I do go too far the other way, and it's something that came up when I was on this retreat recently, that I do kind of bury things a little bit too much, and that it is that sharing with the right kind of people. So yeah. So can you talk us through? So you went to Australia. You would aim to be 100% recovered from chronic fatigue. At that point, you weren't, but you were well enough to go there. Could you talk us through a little bit, kind of how you were when you got to Australia, and then to the point where you were recovered?
Yeah, so I got to Australia, was able to work full time, and so I just got my working holiday visa, moved to Sydney, and was like, look, for me, it was very much this is what I want to do. It's now or never. If I crash, if I have a massive health crash, I know that I will be well enough to get on a plane and fly home if I need to. Mm-hmm. Because I was stabilized to a point where it's like, okay, I would vacillate between 50 to like 80%, 50 to maybe 70% energy levels. And you can hop on a plane and fly home with 50% energy. So, so I gave it a go. I was like, I'm going to do this, and got a full-time job within like a month, 3 weeks to a month, working at the same workplace that I'm working now 3 years later, and continued to seek out different treatments. I tried Ayurvedic medicine for a while. I tried, a pretty restricted diet. I continued my pretty restricted diet. And then I was in a relationship that didn't last very long. It lasted around 3 months, and then after that relationship ended, I had started having severe mental health issues, like severe anxiety. Well, it was actually during the relationship, and then it ended. Then the anxiety continued on, and for the first time in my life, I was like, okay, I need to go to therapy, because I actually don't know what's happening with my mental health. Because it was also like I wasn't really that attached to the guy. It was like, it was like one of those things where it was a complete overreaction to the situation that I couldn't control. And I was like, okay, I need therapy. And so I did 3 months of therapy. Turns out like I disassociated from my emotions for my whole life, not processed a lot of emotions. I have a deep core belief that I'm worthless, perfectionist, all of these things, which now understanding what I've been through, and there was also some traumatic things that happened in my childhood as well, which informed my relationships, both friendships and romantically. And yes, went through a period of like 2 months of counseling where I laid on the floor and cried for like hours every single day. And then I recovered from chronic fatigue syndrome. It's funny to me because I remember moments where I'd just be crying and I could literally feel the fatigue and the pain leave my body as I was crying. And so that was about 1.5 years into living here. I also took up ocean swimming around that same time, which is cold water swimming. And I think that also really helped because cold water swimming can be very beneficial to people with chronic conditions. And yeah, it was kind of like an unexpected byproduct of doing therapy. And I realized at that stage that my health issues were not in my head, as a lot of people say, but were very much related. My physical health is directly correlated with my mental health and my emotions. And I feel negative emotions in my body. And that's the root of my chronic health issues.
Yeah. I think what I am slowly realizing is that pretty much all health issues, but definitely chronic health issues are brought about through something in the mind. Even when it started with, something like Lyme disease, where it's a tick bite. How was that tick? How did that tick bite? How was it able to make the impact that it did? Because of something that was going on mentally. And so I think the sooner people start to try and address the mental side of it, the physical side of it will also be helped. So at that point, you were then, all of your symptoms within like the fatigue symptoms within the space of like a couple of months had gone. You were at 100%. Is that right?
I wouldn't say within a couple, like it was, I would say I went from being at like maybe 70 to a 90 within a couple months. And then there was that last sort of little 10% that took maybe a little bit longer. But I think it's a hard one because I can't really pinpoint exactly this is the day I recovered, because it was a gradual thing. But I started running again, and I remember when I was fatigued, dreaming of a day that I could run again, and dreaming of a day that I would be able to, do just normal things that people like, stay up late and, go to traveling and stuff. And what's been a bit disappointing is I recovered from the CFS, and then like maybe 5 months later, my ankle flared up after it was like a 9-year-old injury, and I haven't been able to walk properly for like 1.5 years. And so I can't run anymore. It was like maybe 3 or 4 months there where I could, which I'm working through that, and I think that I'm going to be recovered from chronic pain in the next 6 months. But I'd love to go back to what you're saying about the mental health component, because I think when people think we're talking about like it's in your head or mental health, it's true, but it's also in the nervous system, at least in my case. So what happened was I experienced some traumatic things in my childhood, which then actually put my nervous system into fight or flight, which I remained, like, I think I was probably in low level fight or flight, for the majority of the rest of my childhood, and then moved to France, was very close to the Bataclan when the terrorist attack on the Bataclan happened in 2015. It was like a block away when that happened, and there was some trauma there from living in Paris post-terrorist attack, and then going from that to the car accident, and then going from that to chronic fatigue. And my body has been in this state of heightened awareness for the last 5 years, specifically since the terrorist attacks and the car accident. And what I've realized is that I actually need to relearn to reteach my body to feel safe. And that's, I think, where a lot of this, chronic pain comes from, and the fatigue and stuff, is when your body's constantly in that heightened level of like anxiety or fight or flight. Like a good sign of that is like if you get startled easily or triggered often or that sort of thing. Like it's like, so it's in your head, but it's also in your nervous system, if that makes sense, right? So it's like you can do the mental health work, but at the end of the day, it's actually, what I'm realizing is that it's like really dealing with those feelings of safety and peace, and focusing on putting myself in situations and being in relationships and having friendships that make me feel safe. And that's the priority. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I for sure wasn't saying any of this is in anyone. And it's important to, I'm glad you said that, because it's important for anyone listening to this to realise that none of this is in anyone's head. It's more, the way I like to kind of describe it is that, when you go to, like, the mind has such a powerful effect on the body. When you go to like the edge of a really like tall building and you look over the edge and you get that horrible feeling that like, just, well, I do anyway, because like that kind of height scares the crap out of me, and like it just like almost like a shiver throughout your body. The fact that in your mind can create that kind of effect in your body, like, just shows that kind of thing over time continually will just create, as you say, it will, like, that kind of trauma, you being exposed to, that family you were staying with in Paris, the terrorist attacks. That means that your body's saying, your mind's actually telling your body, no, you need to be on alert all the time because bad things are going to happen. And then that's going to create that thing over time that eventually, your body's going to start to, disintegrate. Probably a bad word to use, but and is that way? And I think that's what you were saying.
Yeah, and no, I don't think you were also saying that it's in the head, but I also wanted to make that distinction because it's something that I've realized in my own personal journey lately, of like, wow, it's like a mental health thing, but it's also like a safety thing. It's a thing that is actually, I can use all of the techniques and stuff, but at the end of the day, I'm feeling unsafe. So there's a lot of personal work that needs to be done to unwind all of these, events and things, traumatic events, and process them and cry. And that's essentially where CPTSD comes from, is like like it's complex, it's multiple traumatic events. So yeah, and I like to talk about that as well, because I personally think trauma is at the root of a lot of chronic health issues. It's what I'm noticing, especially, and it would make sense as well because a lot of women deal with chronic health issues, and women have obviously been, exposed to a lot of trauma throughout their lives. So yeah, that's my personal theory.
Yeah, no, yeah, and it's definitely had a lot of got a lot of valid points in there for sure. And so what I'd like to, definitely, that's kind of like only part of the story, in the sense of your actual health story. What I'd love to hear about is like how that's actually then caused you to go and do these amazing things that you're doing with Chronic Hope, Sound of Hope. Could you talk us through how you came to set those up, and just talk us through those?
Yeah, no worries. I like to tell the story of how I got the idea for Chronic Hope because it was literally 3 weeks after I moved to Sydney. I was in like this super dodgy Airbnb, cockroaches everywhere,
There
as you do.
is.
Um, Woke up in the middle of the night and just what I felt like what I think was the voice of God that was like, Jamie, I want you to start a non-for-profit organization to help people with chronic illness. I want you to build community. I want you to, and I want you to call it Chronic Hope. Like the name actually came to me in the middle of the night. And I woke up the next morning, I was like, that's my calling. There it is. I found it. So yeah, fast forward a year later, and I decided to, try to figure out what that looked like. I wanted to structure as a non-for-profit because I think obviously you're doing this podcast, and I think a lot of people listening would resonate with this idea of like, I think for me it was, I don't want anyone to have to be confronted with the lack of resources that I was confronted with at the time. I think that was the driving motivator, is like, when people are sitting in bed wanting it to end because it's so hard and they're in so much pain or they're so tired, I want them to be able to access something that gives them hope. Does that make sense? Yeah. Like, because that's, and it's interesting as well with this podcast, because I remember sitting there listening to this podcast that wasn't even on any of the platforms at the time. It's like this dodgy website of phone calls, and I think it was like this British guy just calling people all around the world and hearing their chronic fatigues and recovery stories. And I just listened to that, and I was like, that gave me hope. I was like, I'm going to recover. I needed that to kind of give me the boost. And anyway, so that's the heart behind Chronic Hope. And that's why the name is what it is as well, because it's like taking the word chronic, and we call it chronic illness, chronic condition, chronic pain. Why not chronic hope? You know what I mean? And we have a podcast. We have a digital magazine that we just launched last month. We have original music as well. So we released a single last year called Beyond the Pain. And then we're also coming out with a new arm of Chronic Hope, which is called House of Hope, which is a lifestyle brand. And we're releasing merchandise, and we're also working on putting together a campaign to start selling a water bottle with a twist-off compartment on the bottom where you can put your medication when you leave the house. So the idea behind Chronic Hope as a whole is hope is accessible, and it's tangible. It can be tangible. You can come to Chronic Hope, you can listen to the podcast, you can read our digital magazine, you can wear our merchandise, use our products, and then you can also listen to our music. So it's like all of the touch points for someone I always picture that person laying in bed or sitting in bed like, I don't know how I'm going to keep going. I want them to be able to listen to our music. I want them to be able to read our magazine, to wear our merchandise, which basically says, I am enough, I am hopeful, I am worthy. Because when you wear that, it's a declaration of the truth, which is you are enough, you are hopeful, you are worthy, regardless of how you feel. And then they can also listen to our podcast as well, and listen to other podcasts like yours as well. So that's really the heart behind Chronic Hope. It's like, I don't know, like an ethos, a one-stop shop for someone with chronic illness in a bent that's very much like gives hope to people, if that makes sense.
Wow. Yeah. So, well, a couple of things there. Like, first of all, I just think it's so interesting that because I thought when I was trying to come up with the name for this podcast, I was like, everything that comes after chronic is always pretty negative. Like, what could be like a little bit more inspiring? And so the comeback was like how I came up with that. And I came up with a few terrible ideas before that I won't share. But Chronic Hope, exactly the same thing. And funnily enough, my original idea which would have been after you came up with, the idea was that I wanted someone to have a resource where they could just go and they just, they have at least, something they can cling to in terms of advice. And you've come up with that. I then, as I came up with that idea, was like, whoa, that sounds like quite a lot of work. I'm going to focus just on the podcast and then maybe expand it. But the fact that you've done that I think it's just so amazing, because the problem when you have a chronic health issue is that you've got to go, okay, I've got to go to this area, I've got to go to that area, I've got to go to this area, and it's so overwhelming to have something in one place that can help you in so many different areas of your life and give you hope in so many different areas of your life. I just think it's amazing. And yeah, just commend you for going at it from so many different angles. You could have just done it like me. You could have just done a podcast. You could have just done a magazine. You could have just focused on music. So I really hope that anyone listening to this really checks it out. And yeah, it sounds like this is just the start of it, with the water bottle as well. It just sounds amazing. I mean, are there times where you're feeling a bit overwhelmed by doing all of this in one go, and you're like, oh no, maybe, that you're going back to that original type A personality that's trying to do everything, and you're worried about, your own health again? Is there that part of it?
I'm pretty good at resting. I have a system in place where every single Sunday I turn my phone off, and you can't contact me the whole day. And I rest. I don't work. I don't study. I don't do housework. I just rest. I read books. I watch TV. Write my journal, cry. And if I don't have that, I notice fatigue and like a bit of weariness. But that's like my go-to. But also the whole chronic hope thing, I have to preface with, like, when it started, it was like a dodgy pitch deck that I pitched to like my board members that are currently with me, of like, I want to build hope and awareness, and it was going to originally be an app, and like it just wasn't at all what it looks like today, and has completely evolved. What has helps me find the balance, because I do work full-time, part-time, study full-time, and run a startup, which is Chronic Hope, among other side projects. And I have a really good team. I have a team of 6 volunteers that work with me, and they, one person runs the magazine, one person is project managing House of Hope, the other person looks after the podcast. So I don't do any of the editing. I don't even contact guests. I just get on the podcast and record it and do the conversation. And so I think for me, when I started Chronic Hope, it was like, I want this to be something that helps people, but in a scalable way. And I mean, that's a whole business podcast that we could talk about, right? Like how that all happened. But the goal has been not only to help people in the community, but also to empower my volunteers to get work experience, to feel like they can be part of a really awesome team that's making a difference. And so, yeah, I've delegated a lot and empowered other people to help with the organization. And that's been what's made it possible, if that makes sense. Like I haven't even come up with some of these ideas myself. Some of these ideas for what we're doing aren't even mine. A lot of them, actually, because I've just harnessed the power of teamwork, and given people a space to like innovate and create. Yeah. And that's, yeah. So it does get, yes, to answer your question, that was a roundabout. Yes, it gets overwhelming. And I rest, but I also have to remember that it's just a season. Like, I'm studying right now, studying stressful. I'm not going to be studying forever. Yeah, and I keep my boundaries in place of like, I mean, I'm just, one thing that I've carried over from having chronic fatigue syndrome is that discipline. Because I think when you have chronic illness, you learn to optimize your energy. And now that I'm recovered, I still do that. And probably, I'm more energetic than your normal person because I have that level of discipline.
Yeah, that makes so much sense. And something again which I realised on this recent retreat was I wasn't really putting my health first. I wouldn't set those boundaries. So
Yeah.
I've now put something in place that I've implemented that means that my health is getting put first, and it's going to take a lot of dedication, because again, I'm a type A personality like yourself. Like, I tend to put success and work and everything above my own well-being, because that seems to be, that has always been what's been the most important thing, but it's definitely not the most important thing now. And I think that's an amazing thing to do on a Sunday. I think that's such a cool thing to do. I don't know whether I'll be able to get away with that, but I've got like a kind of a different kind of coping mechanism, which I think that's amazing. But just going back to, I guess, the darker times, the times where maybe you didn't feel like you could get through it, and you thought maybe you'd have thoughts like, is this going to last forever? Those kind of thoughts. There's going to be a lot of people listening to this, and obviously who are part of your community, who have those thoughts right now. What would be your advice to those people in their darkest hours, to get them through to the point where you're at now, where they can see a life that's worth living?
I mean, it sounds really cliche, but it's don't give up. Like, just don't, like, because that's, going back to those darker times, sometimes I forget how bad it was, but there was moments where I'd lay in bed and I would be like, I do not know what, like, I'd be dreaming about moving to Sydney. I'd be dreaming about standing in front of the Opera House, and I'd be like, I don't know if that's ever going to be possible. And it was a flare, and I remember just thinking, like, I can't give up. I'm not going to give up, because I know there's hope. I knew there was, like, I had made a decision to recover, and I knew that it was going to happen. It was like this deep knowing inside of me. And not everyone has that, which is why I created Chronic Hope, which is why I love sharing my story, because I'm here to tell you that there's hope, because I've lived it. I've walked it. I'm a living, breathing example of where I've been, and where how bad it can get and how good it can also get. Because, like, I guess we didn't fully go into how bad it got, but, like, I was housebound. I couldn't work for 9 months. I, was in 10 out of 10 pain some days. I could barely leave the house. And it wasn't like a super severe chronic fatigue syndrome, but it was pretty bad. And so going from that to where I am now, like, I know there's hope. I know there's options, and I have authority to speak that because I've lived it. So if you're listening, just remember there's hope.
Awesome.
Chronic hope.
Yes. Awesome. Yeah. Cool. And I guess just finally, and I kind of know the answer to this, but I'd like to maybe give a little bit more detail. Like, let's say someone gave you the opportunity to go back to that time in Paris, because your life could be very different. So, you could be speaking French right now, living in Paris. Had you not got, the physical symptoms that you had, you could have gone on and lived a very normal life. Going back to those times, I mean, if someone gave you the opportunity to just carry on down that path and not had to go through what you went through, would you do that? And if not, could you tell me about the good things that have happened as a result of your chronic illness?
Do you ask this question to everyone?
I do, but maybe in a that was a really long-winded question.
Well, I don't know. I feel like I should say that I wouldn't change it, you know what I mean? But I think I would. I think I would go back, because at the end of the day, I always believed that and was always aspiring to make a difference in people's lives and do something that was beyond myself. And I think that I would have gotten there regardless of having lived with chronic illness. but I don't, yeah, you
The-
have to edit out these pauses.
no,
But it's a hard one because I wouldn't wish it on myself, and two, I wouldn't wish it on anyone else.
yeah,
If that makes sense. Like you know, you want people to understand what you're going through, but at the same time, you would never wish them to have chronic illness or chronic pain. And what we're working towards is that people don't have to deal with that, either prevention or options. So I think that, yeah, I'd go back and I wouldn't want to be in that car accident. I wouldn't want to, you know, have dealt with that chronic fatigue and chronic pain. I'm thankful for it. I'm thankful that it's given me empathy. I'm thankful that for the person that it's allowed me to become. And there's so many good things that have come out of it, for sure. So I think, yeah, I think that at the same, yeah, I don't know. It's one of those things where it's like, I don't regret it, but at the same time, I wouldn't go back and say, oh, I'd do it all over again. And I've talked to people in the community that would say that about their condition, and that's great.
yeah.
I wouldn't.
I think well, first of all, I commend you for such an honest answer. I think the question more should be, what are the, you know, what are the positive things that you could take from, you know, from your, you know, from your the issues that you've had, because, you know, chronic hope and all of the difference that you're making to other people's lives right now, you know, that wouldn't have come about had you not got sick, right? You wouldn't have had those. So I don't think it's a case of, yeah, would you go back and live it all again? Because Jesus, no one wants to live that life twice. And, you know, I'm in the, you know, I'm in the middle of it myself at the moment, and it's very difficult for me to say you know, I'm happy it happened, but I can see why my life is so different now and why it will be different in future because of what's happened to me. But if someone offered me the opportunity to go and live it all again, I'd say, hell no, no chance. Yeah. But I mean, I think, you know, when you look back on kind of all the amazing things that has happened to you recently, and I guess maybe in 5 years' time, when even more great things have happened, you'll be able to see maybe more of that fork in the road. And I don't know, if you didn't deal with it there and then, maybe that trauma that you'd been through earlier on in your life would have come up later on in your life, and you'd have had to deal with it a different way. And I think we're all going to have to deal with this shit eventually. It's almost good that you know, you could have dealt with it so earlier on in your life.
Yeah, and I think totally, and I think that's kind of what I was getting at as well. I'm like, you know what? I think that in any case, there was going to be stuff that came up. Yeah. But yes, I'm so thankful for things. I think one of the biggest things I'm thankful for is having started Chronic Hope. And because before I started Chronic Hope, my biggest aspiration was to like become an executive assistant for like some executive in Sydney. And then I started Chronic Hope, and I got this group of people around me that really believed in me and started speaking things over me like, Jami, Chronic Hope's just the beginning. You're going to do more. You're going to start more businesses. And seeing that potential in me to like go beyond just Chronic Hope, which is already amazing and will be amazing, but what's after that? And realizing like my passion for entrepreneurship and my passion for creating businesses that help people, but also are sustainable and make money at the same time, which then can go back into other initiatives that help people. So it's like that part, definitely. I don't know if I would have really gone down the entrepreneurship or starting business path if I hadn't had dealt with chronic illness, because that was never the original plan. It was always going to be like, get a job, you know? So that's probably one of the biggest things I'm thankful for.
Well, I think you've just answered my question, really. I mean, you've gone from potentially being, you know, I'm sure a very talented and executive assistant to a, you know, CEO of many companies further down the line, living in Australia. Like those two paths are very, very different. And yeah, I guess I need to phrase my question a little bit better in future. But I think it's very clear, like for me anyway, like the amazing things that have happened as a result of it. It's just the time that you went through is obviously you wouldn't want to wish that on yourself or anyone. I completely understand that. If people wanted to, and also you're a bit of an inspiration to me in the sense that you've got this. I love the fact that you said that you created an environment for people to create these other ideas, because I think people, you're almost like trying to not take the credit for that, but no, that's the whole point of like building a business. You build an environment, and that's what me and my business partner are trying to do now. We're trying to build a structure so that other people can realize the vision that we're trying to create. And no, I think that's amazing. So if people wanted to, first of all, two things. If people wanted to reach out to you and just ask you, questions about anything that's come up today, is that okay? And if so, what's the best way of them getting hold of you?
Yeah, so best way to reach out to me is through Chronic Hope, our Instagram account, which is chronic_hope. And yeah, feel free to reach out. Any questions, any comments or anything, give us a follow. Also follow House of Hope, which we're launching in a couple months. That's the best way to get in touch.
Awesome. And just a little bit more detail in terms of Chronic Hope. If someone is really struggling at the moment and they want to contact you guys about kind of just helping them out in everything, is it best for them to just still reach out on Instagram, or is it go to the website? Or
yeah, they can reach out on the website. Instagram is probably the quickest way to get a hold of us. And then on our website and our Instagram, all of the resources that we have are linked in our bio. So you can see the digital magazine, the podcast, the music, and then what we're soon launching, which is House of Hope.
Awesome. Look, thank you so much for coming on, and you just being so honest and I guess raw with your story, and it's been really inspiring for me, but I also know for everyone listening. So the fact that you've recovered, but you've gone on and done these amazing things, and that you're not stopping there, you're going to take things to another level, which I'm definitely going to be following and taking further inspiration from. So thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
No worries. And hopefully, I'm sure you'll be getting many messages after this episode.
I hope so. I hope everyone messages and I get connected with a bunch of new people.
Absolutely.